I love video games. Okay, maybe that statement's a little too vague. Let me try again. Video games are my favorite of all the artistic mediums out there, and they're the hobby that has done the most to get me through the hard times in life. But, like all loves, my love of video games has had its good times and its bad times. And the 2010s were probably more bad than good, at least for my tastes. Much of the decade was spent eroding everything I love about the medium. It had fully gone mainstream and lost much of the subculture feel that made me feel like I fit in here. Offline single-player games were deemed a thing of the past, mostly by companies, but it took several very high-profile releases late in the decade to prove this wrong. Mobile games spread their corrupting influences. The mid-budget title largely ceased to exist. The industry shifted increasingly towards catering to American tastes, leaving many niche Japanese titles that I love out in the cold. But at least we got Dark Souls out of it, and FromSoft finally got the success they deserved. And there's still some good games, of course. But I still think the decade was mostly not great. So by the end of it, my interest in video games was waning, which probably sounds weird to hear from a guy with a YouTube channel about them. But then 2019 happened and it lit a fire in my heart again. So I want to do a video to look back on 2019, now that, oh dear God, it's already been 5 years. But this seemed like the right time to do it. Close enough that it's still fairly fresh in my mind, but just long enough ago that it feels appropriate for a retrospective. Plus 5 years is a good round number. So let's look back, because 2019 was my favorite year in video games at the perfect time that I really needed to learn to love them again. Oh yeah, and I should probably qualify that when I say it's my favorite, it was my favorite based on my experience living through the year. If I look back and take the sum total of the games during a year, there's probably some years during the aughts that were better, especially when the PS2 and GameCube were in full swing. But for me, a lot of my appreciation of those years is only in retrospect. Hence, 2019 is my favorite. First up, on January 25th, we had the Resident Evil 2 remake, which really came out at just the right time for me. I'd only really finally gotten into Resident Evil in 2018, playing the HD version of Resi 1 and the PC port of the original version of Resi 4 that year. So I was primed and hungry for more Resident Evil, and the remake of 2 delivered, offering a perfect modern survival horror experience. See, at the time, classic survival horror had been in a bit of a rough place. The big budget stuff, including Resident Evil titles such as 5 and 6, had gone too far into action, while most successful, smaller horror titles went in the opposite direction, greatly disempowering the player and often leaving them with no option but to run from monsters. The former were pretty unpopular, and the latter had their fans, but don't necessarily hit the same notes as classic survival horror, like the early Resident Evil titles. And plus there was a lot of debate as to how to even do classic survival horror, which I won't even get into. But then the Resident Evil 2 remake came out, and yeah, it was bloody fantastic. All the best parts of classic survival horror translated perfectly into modern third-person shooter gameplay. You've got the slow and deliberate movement and shooting that keeps things tense. You've got the carefully limited resources that press you to take risks and make trade-offs to try and conserve ammo. You've got a close-in camera that replicates the limited vision you could get with the classic fixed camera angles with none of the annoying bits. You've got the excellent and oppressive atmosphere held up by the excellent visuals of the then fairly new RE engine. And of course, this wouldn't be Resident Evil without puzzles, which are compelling enough, not complex enough to bog things down, but enough that playing it for the first time I would sometimes break out a piece of paper to jot down a code or a solution. And the game does a lot to make the most of its content too. The game wants you to play through as both protagonists, but it does a good job of making the second playthrough different enough to be compelling. Not to mention more difficult to keep it interesting. Plus, there's also a surprising amount of side content too. There's the fourth survivor mode from the original RE2, letting you play as the Umbrella Agent Hunk and giving you an inventory loaded with supplies and a long gauntlet to get through with absolutely no further supplies to be found along the way. Plus, there's the Ghost Survivors episodes that were added in a free update. 3 short scenarios with some unique rules where you play as 3 different characters in hypothetical scenarios. Nothing huge, but a nice little post-release content drop. And on top of this, there's unlockable bonus weapons and costumes, providing some extra bonuses to players who are inclined to replay the game. A great treat for survival horror fans new and old, the RE2 remake was just the start of a very promising year. Thankfully, the Resident Evil 2 remake was not a very long game, because only about a week later, on February 1st, the next title I cared about would come out, Ace Combat 7. And Ace Combat is another older series I got into way later. Like, I'm pretty sure I only played the PS2 games in 2018, just like with the Resident Evil games. But I quickly became very fond of them. And Ace Combat 7 sure was a new Ace Combat game. Okay, maybe that's a little harsh. I mean, it is getting on this list after all. Ace Combat 7 was the first mainline Ace Combat game since Ace Combat 6 in 2007. So maybe just bringing back Ace Combat and being pretty good was all it had to be. And it's not like the game is phoned in either. The flight model is incredible. You can really feel the way that the wind and the air affect your flight, yet it never quite feels too obtrusive and like you get screwed over out of nowhere. Although the fact you have the ability to instantly go hyper-maneuverable by forcing a post-stall maneuver by just hitting accelerate and decelerate at once does kind of take away from the feeling of the flight. But that aside, the game also looks absolutely stunning. While visual fidelity might not be as important when you're blitzing through the sky at incredible speeds, what the creators do with it is another matter. The scenery is incredible, especially that one mission everyone remembers from the trailers where you're flying through valleys lined with trees. If I do have one issue with the gameplay though, there's a lot of cases where the planes are clearly balanced for multiplayer even when you're using them in single player. So the Falcon and its tactical laser system went from this to this. And this is even despite it being paid DLC in Ace Combat 7. There's also a customization system where you can install different parts in your planes, which has some interesting aspects, but is ultimately superfluous and very clearly more geared for multiplayer, considering this system was clearly taken from the free-to-play multiplayer game Ace Combat Infinity. But really, I feel like the biggest shortfall of the game is its story. It takes the Ace Combat 4 approach of being rather detached and impersonal, which is fine if not my preference compared to the plots of 5 and 0, but the bigger problem with this game is that it loves to introduce and then drop entire themes of the plot without really resolving them. A big deal was made in the marketing about the fact that Trigger, the player character, is part of a penal unit, but that's dropped halfway through and it really just serves to add some spice to the early part of the game that is normally just routine missions while you build up your reputation. When one of your squad finds some information he shouldn't know but is then accidentally shot down during some IFF confusion, it doesn't go anywhere. While Mihaly is a very cool rival character and probably one of the best executed of any such characters in these games, the new versus old theme that they seem to be setting up with him just doesn't seem to go anywhere. I mean, he's cool, but he's just there to give you a major named rival for most of the game, even if he does do that fairly well. Heck, the final fight with him is just kind of there to be a final fight with him. The final fight has absolutely nothing to do with the war or the secondary conflict after the end of the war. No, instead the climax focuses on the new side of that old versus new. Drones and technology. I mean, it should be an easy topic to do something with, given the controversies around the use of military drones in the real world. So, what do they have to say about it? Well, mostly it just ends up being the vehicle for this game's "it was a Belkin plot" twist. For non-Ace Combat fans, that is a twist that has been done so often it stopped being remotely surprising. And it undermines a lot of the good ideas the game had. It lessens the impact of a war where both sides do some pretty sketchy shit by making you view both sides as the victims of this conspiracy. And the terror of a runaway drone dead set on perpetuating a war is undermined by the fact that it was made to do that by some unrealistic evil conspiracy. The guy behind it just inexplicably had a change of heart after it was too late. It's not as much a rogue terror as just doing what it was meant to do. Scarcely different from any other weapon. Ace Combat 7 does have a good plot in there somewhere. In fact, it has several, and that's kind of the issue here. None of them really get the focus they deserve, they're not linked together in a compelling way, and it instead distracts itself with other plot lines and themes that go nowhere. I'm sure some people will find it weird that I care about the plot in these games at all, but to me at least, the Metal Gear with planes sort of batshit insane plots and crazy super weapons are a major part of the charms of these games. There was also a DLC campaign released in 3 episodes across September, October, and November. While perhaps priced a little high, the fact that they're sold one mission at a time doesn't matter as much as you'd think, as these are massive missions with plenty of gameplay variety in each. Notably, you basically need an endgame or DLC plane to play them, for no other reason than because these are the only planes with enough missiles to deal with the sheer volume of enemies. And while none of the DLC's themes are quite as compelling as some of the best ideas in the main game, the tight plotting means that the game doesn't have time to get lost introducing and dropping ideas that go nowhere. It was great, honestly better than the main game, and also the Alicorn is possibly the coolest super weapon in any Ace Combat game. So yeah, Ace Combat 7 was pretty good, even if I think Project Wingman would do the Ace Combat Simcade style of flight game better the following year. Now we've got another installment in a long-running series, but this one's a bit more obscure. Etrian Odyssey is one of my favorite series, and it has occupied a very special place in my heart ever since I played the second game. It's also a series that felt eternally chained to the DS and 3DS. Using the touchscreen to draw a map like you're using graph paper in the 80s is probably the most fun and clever use of the DS touchscreen. Between this and Persona Q2, Atlus kept supporting the 3DS because, well, these are games that needed a bit more development to be able to work on the Switch or any other platform. So it stayed on the 3DS. But with Nintendo ending the DS line, it seemed for a while like Etrian Odyssey would die with it. And it was in that context that Nexus released. See, Nexus is not like the rest of the series. Instead, it is designed as a greatest hits sort of game. It doesn't bring a ton new to the plate, instead taking stuff from every prior game. 21 classes, only one is new, but we have a ton of returning fan favorites. Some of the best systems from throughout the franchise. A mix of old and new locations, somewhere around twice as much content as any other game in the franchise. If you have to end a series, not a bad way to do it. Unfortunately, these decisions also came with their own issues. Ultimately, the game wound up feeling like it went for quantity over quality. Although Etrian Odyssey going quantity over quality is still one of the best RPGs out there. It only really is an issue when you're comparing it against other games in the series. But to go into details, there's a ton of classes, but the roster is very biased towards damage dealing and ailment classes, with key roles such as the defensive class and the buffing class only really having one option to choose from. Even though throughout the series there are takes on each of these concepts that is different enough that I think they would have worked beautifully here. And while some returning systems like the force boost and brake system are fantastic, others don't quite stick the landing. For instance, the skill system from the fourth game, which gates skills behind certain level thresholds, doesn't work as well in the context of this game where the level cap is much higher, but the thresholds have not been adjusted to compensate. So I found myself unlocking the highest tier of skills only about halfway through the game. A bit under that even. Additionally, in Nexus, the early labyrinths are really creative. Even though they're returning areas from past games, they throw in their own unique twists, including several ideas that the series hasn't done anything like them before. It's really incredible. Etrian Odyssey is often a little too conservative in sticking to the same exploration loop, so seeing some unexpected twists is fantastic. But then, about a quarter of the way into the game, these all just dry up. And from there, it's a fairly no-frills Etrian Odyssey game. Having them taken away, especially in a game this long, is really disappointing. And I say this as someone whose favorite title in the series is the very no-frills Etrian Odyssey 5. I just think that Nexus needed those frills a lot more than most games do in this series. Also, I sort of lied earlier when I said there were new locations, plural. There is one new dungeon tile set that is used for 3 different 5-floor labyrinths in a game where all the returning labyrinths are 3 or 4 floors, plus 1 single floor dungeon, then reskinned for 5 more floors, and then reskinned a 3rd time for 5 last floors. There are more floors using the Shrine tile set and recolors than there are in the entirety of Etrian Odyssey 3. Can you see why I might have gotten a little sick of it by the end? And speaking of, the game is just way too long. It easily took me twice as long to beat Nexus as it did to beat Etrian Odyssey 5. And Etrian Odyssey 5 is not a short game. This does check out because it has about twice as many floors, but this is a series that already can feel tedious and repetitive to people who aren't absolutely in love with it. Nexus was the first time I felt that tedium, even as someone who's been a serious fan of the series since the second game. Of course, this is all probably not helped by the fact that the game was probably rushed thanks to the speed at which the 3DS was dying off after the Switch released. But the fact that it was probably overly ambitious didn't help. They didn't need to include twice as many classes and floors as any other game in the series, but they chose to anyway. I would gladly play a game that is half as long but twice as creative and able to keep including those early game twists for the entirety of the game. I probably seem too down on this one, don't I? I still love it. It's one of the weakest games in the series, sure, but this is one of my favorite series of all time. It still does everything the series excels at, with fun exploration, puzzles, and delightfully tactical turn-based battles. And the sheer quantity and excess of the game, even going so far as to raise the level cap to 130 in the post-game, is its own brand of stupid fun. But really, I also don't see much point in trying that hard to sell anyone on this game. If you've never played an Etrian Odyssey game before, this is a terrible place to start. The worst even. Play literally any other game in this series. But for fans of the series, well, if you haven't picked it up, you should, is what I'd say if the 3DS eShop were still around. Tough luck, eh? You can probably find it on whatever your online game shopping place of choice is. And when March 8th rolled around, well, I was just getting motivated. Out of all the games I played this year, Devil May Cry 5 was almost certainly the one I had been most looking forward to. I remember being hyped as fuck when this was announced, and then when I got to play a demo of this at PAX West the year before, I just got even more excited. I still have a lanyard with the pins I got somewhere. This probably had done the most to get me excited about video games again, honestly. It had every right to disappoint, though. Reviving a series after so long was risky business. It could change too much and alienate the fans, or it could play it too safe and just make a game devoid of any passion. But it worked. It fucking worked. Devil May Cry 5 takes the attempts to expand the combat from DMC4, polishes them up, and then runs with them. Having replayed DMC3 lately, I was surprised by how restrained it feels compared to DMC5. This isn't a strike against it, mind you, it's still a masterpiece, but I guess what I'm getting at is that the series has changed more since DMC3 than people give it credit for. DMC3 is a lot more focused and controlled, while DMC5 goes to a glorious success. First up, Nero is back, and with some tweaks to his moveset that make him a lot more enjoyable than his DMC4 debut, as well as helping him stand out more from Dante. He loses his Devilbringer arm, along with the grab attacks it provided and the demonic power that fuels his charge shots and Devil Trigger. In its place, though, he gains a few new moves for his sword to fully flesh out his sole melee weapon, the ability to load 3 high-power shots into his revolver, and most importantly, the Devil Breaker, a selection of cybernetic arms that give Nero his own moveset variety that he previously lacked. Unlike Dante's weapons, though, Nero can't swap them out freely, encouraging you to treat them more as disposable options. Dante, likewise, takes the potential insanity of his DMC4 version style change, and then takes things even further, while at the same time alleviating the few issues with that version of the character. He has a nice selection of 4 melee weapons and 4 guns, nearly as many as the 5 of each in DMC3. He can bring all 4 if you want to have the full suite of options, or just bring 3 or even 2 if you'd rather have concise and easy switching between weapons to emulate DMC3. And just to make sure that Dante doesn't fall behind, he also gets a refresh on some of his most long-standing movesets. Ebony and Ivory get some significant buffs while in gunslinger style. They can fire independently, some of their special moves can deal some really great damage, and the new auto-charge mechanic also affects all of the special moves, making Dante's iconic handguns finally feel as badass as he always made them look. Balrog is an incredible take on the hand-to-hand combat weapon Dante always gets, with a unique stance system that makes it effectively 2 weapons in one. And even his sword moveset gets a pretty substantial refresh, letting him keep up with the other more focused movesets of other characters. The newcomer V brings a much more unique moveset where he uses summons to fight for him instead of fighting himself, since instead he only moves in to finish enemies off. While I don't enjoy it as much as the others, it's still neat and refreshing. It's nice to have the variety, and V has his own unique sense of style as a result. And of course, I can't neglect to mention the Alpha and the Omega himself, Virgil. I won't linger on it because he wasn't actually added to the game until later. Every moment of gameplay as Virgil is a delight, though. Each of his weapons is as fully featured as Nero's singular sword moveset, and the mix of his summoned sword special attacks, his doppelganger devil trigger, and his sin devil trigger make managing your devil trigger gauge a surprisingly engaging aspect of gameplay as Virgil. Sadly, no playable Lady or Trish this time around. Really would have liked to see that after they got added to DMC4 in its special edition, but sadly DMC5 special edition only comes with Virgil. But I think the biggest thing that Devil May Cry 5 gets right is the enemy design, which is also one of the things that I feel went most wrong with DMC4. In fact, 5 may have the best enemy design of any game in the series, thanks in part to bringing back many of the best foes from throughout the franchise. Enemies are varied, giving rise to a variety of combat situations and encouraging the use of different abilities and combos, but unlike was often the case in DMC4, they never feel like they take away from the fun due to not being designed for your current character or railroading you too hard into a very specific approach. No ghosts that can only be made vulnerable by very specific attacks, no weird parasites that break your combos just by existing, and no trace of those fucking blitz enemies that require a million ranged attack hits to make them vulnerable and are just a complete fucking headache for Virgil. It's clear that they learned from DMC4's issues and built a fantastic enemy roster that works for any of the playable characters. Even Virgil, who was only added in the special edition. The only real complaint I have is that the level design is pretty plain and is just a linear gauntlet of fights without any of the exploration of other DMC games. And that isn't even a downside for many people, but personally I do like the sense of adventure that the exploration sections and interconnected maps gave to these games, but some people might feel that just gets in the way of the fight, so if you're one of those people, then DMC5 is going to be even better for you. Oh, and I also take issue with the fact that the special edition is still, years later, exclusive to the latest generation of consoles. No PC version in sight, despite DMC5 Special Edition including features that were introduced in the PC port of the base version of DMC4. Maybe someday. But like how I only sort of glossed over Virgil, this has nothing to do with the game at launch, and so it isn't really a factor on how I enjoyed the game at the time. Because I swear to Sparta, I could gush about this game forever. There's so much I didn't even have time to mention, like how the dynamic music and the slow-mo on finishing an encounter make fights even more awesome. There's a certain finality to DMC5 where I'd be content if this was the last game in the series, and even if they do continue it, it feels like they'll need to change a lot, but that's a whole other topic. Because DMC5 was only one of the reasons that I decided to do this video in March, because March was easily the best month of my favorite year of video games. And of course, the other half of why March was my favorite month was Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, releasing on the 22nd. Two of my favorite games just ever came out within the same month. And Sekiro was damn special. Getting to see From Software put all their experience from Dark Souls and Bloodborne, not to mention the many, many games before that, into a new, even more focused action-adventure game. And in my mind, that is what it is. An action-adventure game, not a Souls-like. In my book, Souls-likes are, by definition, required to be RPGs. And Sekiro is about as much of an RPG as your average Zelda game. Probably less of an RPG than the last couple. There are definitely some elements of RPGs and Souls-likes here, but those elements are everywhere in modern games. If every game with a basic skill tree where you are ultimately expected to get just about everything counts as an RPG, then like 90% of modern games are RPGs. But definitions aside, Sekiro is a somewhat divisive game, and probably not the last one on this list, though for different reasons. I'm firmly of the opinion that there's no wrong way to play a Dark Souls game, and the myriad of approaches they allow is one of the few things that makes these titles anything resembling approachable. But Sekiro is not like that. Sekiro demands you fulfill a certain role, and if you cannot or simply don't want to, the game is not going to meet you halfway on this. But for me, well, this playstyle Sekiro wants you to adopt falls awfully close to my preferred playstyle in games like Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. Just an improved version of that. And here's where Sekiro provides an interesting insight into game design. Because it is more focused, it can deliver one playstyle far better than that playstyle could ever be in a game, where it has to coexist with a dozen others. Put another way, Dark Souls could never make any of its available playstyles as satisfying as Sekiro's without sacrificing their variety, and Sekiro couldn't have the sheer variety of approaches that Dark Souls has without sacrificing on quality. Sekiro is a game of clashing blades. Much like Dark Souls was when that game got big, it demands its own rhythms, and your experiences from other games will only throw you off. And that includes your experiences from Dark Souls. Existing somewhere between the aggression of Bloodborne and the defense of Dark Souls, Sekiro's combat is all about constantly switching between offense and defense at the drop of a hat. Enemies attack and you're expected to block with perfect timing, or in some cases perform a different defense against guard break attacks. And then as soon as your enemies give you an opening, you're expected to go on the offense, wearing down your enemy's guard. But the moment you hear a louder clang and see a brighter flash, these same signals as your own perfect blocks, you need to ease off because the enemy is about to go back on the offensive. The result is a game that, once you get used to it, feels kind of like a rhythm game. Compared to Dark Souls and Bloodborne, dodging is relatively useless. It's all about parrying because that lets you turn the enemy's attacks against them. Even if you dodge successfully, you're not gaining anything. But when you parry successfully, you are constantly gaining ground even when the enemy's the one attacking. And then most encounters end not with a depleted health bar, but with an enemy's stance being broken to open them up to a beautifully animated death blow. And then this is all further fleshed out with special attacks, shinobi tools, and stealth kills, all of which help you have a bit more input over combat than just going with the flow. Honestly, when I first played it, this combat system threw me off for longer than I would have liked. But once it all clicked into place, the fact that it was so much more focused made From Software's skills shine all the brighter. Dueling against a boss or a mini-boss in Sekiro is satisfying in a way that no fight in Dark Souls or Elden Ring could ever really be. And of course, this is all topped up with a surprisingly good degree of exploration. The world is nicely laid out to give you a selection of choices of where to explore next, with basically everything radiating outward from the central Ashina castle. So yeah, Sekiro is basically perfect for me with how I always like to play Dark Souls. Yeah, sure, it's not for everyone, but games don't have to be. Most people adored Elden Ring, but I kinda didn't. So, let me have this. Whatever, this is my list, and Sekiro is my favorite FromSoft game since Dark Souls 1. It was one of the stars of the year and I loved it. But then things slowed down a little, which I'm honestly fine with. See, at the time I lived in a place with a shitty landlord, and I had no air conditioning for several months thanks to some stuff. So yeah, that really cut down on my gaming progress because I couldn't really focus and my patience was greatly limited. I don't do well with heat. I probably would have beaten the super boss at Etrian Odyssey Nexus if not for this. It just was a little too difficult and stressful for me to play in that kind of heat. There were still some very fun games during this period though, mostly indies and smaller titles, and of course those games are a big part of what made this year special, but if I gave every game I played this year its own segment, this video would be 4 hours long. Look forward to that when I remake this video in 5 more years. But an interesting result of this is that the biggest months in this year for me are really spread out, March and November. But there's a couple of games to get to before we get to November. Then on August 30th, we had another nice surprise, Astral Chain. It's a rather unconventional action game, but it absolutely shows Platinum Games at their best and most creative, though. Gonna keep this one short because I don't have a capture card, so doing stuff about Switch games is kind of a pain. In Astral Chain, you play as a new recruit to an organization known as Neuron, a special task force dedicated to fighting invisible monsters from another dimension known as chimeras, using a legion, basically a stand with a chain attached. The combat is focused on controlling your legion and character together. Individually, the controls are simple, and to be honest, the early game eases you into it a little too slowly. Even once it fully gets going, I'd hesitate to call the combat deep, but it is interesting and unique, which I find sometimes is more important. It's impactful and satisfying, and there's enough variety and options to be compelling as expressive choices. The game also features a fair bit of exploration, conducting investigations, and using your legion to just help people out. You definitely spend a lot of time getting lost if you so choose. Most chapters consist of an open exploration section, followed by more linear gauntlet of fights, giving a nice bit of variety and a nice sense of pacing to the gameplay loop. Unfortunately though, the story is pretty plain and predictable. The twists are not that surprising, I hesitate to call them twists, and I don't really remember it ever going anywhere substantial. Very generic paint-by-numbers plot here. Could just be my memory though, but unfortunately it really doesn't do that much with its setting, which is a shame when there's so many cool ideas floating around here. Honestly, at the time I felt like this might have been my favorite game of 2019, just for how unexpected and unique it was. Unfortunately, going back to get footage, I did not find myself engaged with this to the same degree as most of the other titles on the list, but maybe that's just down to the slow start I mentioned. I still recommend giving the game a shot. 2 months later, on October 1st, we have Gundam Battle Operation 2, which weirdly is a game that I don't associate at all with this year, but this is apparently when it came out, and I guess the timeline lines up in my head. But one look at the channel's backlog and you'll see that it clearly was a big part of my life for a while. It's a rare mech game that goes for the anime mech style, but still has a sense of weight to it. Which of course is a very important balance to hit for Universal Century Gundam's endless, futile, brutal warfare. The steady pace combined with the long times to kill created a fairly tactical battle of positioning between teams, and especially in my preferred 5v5s, strikes a perfect balance between teamwork and individual skill. There were plenty of tactics and options available, and it did its best to represent all the different playable mobile suits. The game was really great for me for a few years, but eventually I did quit for many reasons. The meta had increasingly been shifting in directions I disliked, especially with power creep. The introduction of a new 4-star rarity made the game's previously shockingly fair gacha system just as bullshit as any other. And ultimately, the game was just making me miserable to play. Between the feeling of obligation at this point having gone on for years, and the fact that it brought out all the worst sorts of competitive sides to me. But I had fun with it for the time, and I still look back on it fondly, but it's also another game that's not for everyone. It's a game that I've seen tends to average a 3 out of 5 rating, split pretty evenly between 1 out of 5 and 5 out of 5. Which, hey, I'd say is better than a game that everyone thinks is 3 out of 5. Kinda weird to put it on this list, but look, I can't deny it made a big impact on me. I had to mention it here, even if it's just a short section. And speaking of divisive games, on November 8th we got Death Stranding. A beautiful game where Hideo Kojima just made the weird thing he wanted to without worrying about things like mass market appeal. And you know what? I was fully here for it. The fact that we got a game like this in the modern games industry is mind-blowing. Honestly, while I'm not big on hero worship, look, if Hideo Kojima's clout means that he can get a game this contrary to conventional wisdom made, then you know what? Yeah, we need more Rockstar developers like him. If that's what it takes to get more genuinely creative games, I'm all for it. But Death Stranding, as you probably know, is a game about simply traversing back and forth. But it makes that traversal interesting, with little mechanics to make you think about every little movement. A sharp contrast to many video games where you just blunder through your movements without much care or precision. Much like navigating rough terrain in real life, you have to watch where you step and be mindful of your momentum. It reminds me a fair bit of exploring the mountain wilderness back when I was a kid. That makes me sound way more outdoorsy than I ever was, but... And of course you also have to use the expanding variety of tools that the game gives you in order to get through the environments quicker, safer, and more easily. But I think one of the most striking things about Death Stranding is how seamlessly its themes are integrated into the gameplay. Said themes are mostly based around the idea that people are stronger together, hardly a rare theme, especially in Japanese media. And it is constant throughout the story, right down to the idea that Sam's work as a porter is valuable because he connects people over great distances. But rarely are themes so well borne out through gameplay, but here it's done elegantly and brilliantly. The game's online mechanics mostly consist of structures you build or tools you place, having the potential to appear in other players' games. And as the game goes on, this becomes more and more important. In the early game, it doesn't matter much. It saves you some resources and helps you get to certain places easier. In the mid-game, it becomes helpful because there are these roads you can build that take quite a bit of resources, making them impractical for someone to build out all by themselves, but very feasible with online players working together. And these roads can speed things up quite a bit. And then in the late game, once the roads run out and you're hiking through the mountains, you gain access to building these zipline posts. They can connect to any other post within range, but they can only be set where you stand, so building them alone can take a fair bit of legwork, and being able to use the work of other players is incredibly useful. When I zoom from one zip line to the next, flying across the map at incredible speeds, it feels wonderful. Like every leap I make is me getting helped along by a different player. We'll never meet, but we've worked together and I'm able to cross these distances with ease thanks to them. It makes me very conscious of the way that other people's efforts are benefiting me, and I think this is something that everyone could do with being a little more aware of in real life. But getting back to the game, I think the evolution of how you traverse is where a lot of the game's fun lies. You gradually gain new tools as you're given more challenges to overcome, and combined with learning new techniques, until by the end of the game, your final delivery feels more like an extreme sports competition than post-apocalyptic postal work. Oh, but don't worry, the game does still occasionally go full Kojima. I seem to recall the ending sequence lasting like 2 hours with only scattered bits of gameplay, so there's that warning. But Death Stranding is a game all about its navigation, perhaps most similar to something like Breath of the Wild. If you're the type of person to get impatient about slow traversal in a game, you'll probably hate this. But if you like to take your time and enjoy the journey, well, maybe it'll click with you. Me? Well, it's on the list, isn't it? I much prefer elements in the game to be time-consuming but engaging and meaningful, rather than be quicker but be truly meaningless. And I'm also not the sort of person to obsess over the good part of the gameplay loop. As sort of counterexamples, I am not the biggest fan of the movement mechanics in games like Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis or Monster Hunter Rise, because they make it too easy and dull to move around. Sure, it's relatively quick and flashy, but it's not instant, and it's so easy that what time you do spend on the movement is even more boring. I definitely wouldn't want every game to play like Death Stranding does, but I feel like maybe it has something to teach us about the value of making even the parts of games that people tend to dismiss as boring or padding into something a bit more meaningful and engaging. Next, on November 14th, we got another game for the pleasant surprise list. An actually good Star Wars game for the first time in forever. Remember, this was not long after the new Battlefront 2, when EA's reputation was probably at its absolute worst. The idea that they'd make a single-player, story-based Star Wars game with no bullshit was pretty out there, considering this was one of the companies that most pushed microtransactions and most wanted to do away with single-player games because multiplayer games are better for selling microtransactions. But somehow this game happened, and it was really good. It sits in that same, not quite as Souls-like, but heavily influenced by them, space as Sekiro does. Heck, it plays suspiciously similar to Sekiro in many ways, including the emphasis on breaking your enemy's defense for a finishing blow. But hey, I ain't complaining. It also does lean a bit more into the Metroidvania elements. In fact, I would primarily describe this game as a 3D, third-person Metroidvania. Exploring the different planets is a great experience, but what's really impressive to me is how they fit all of these components together to really lean into the idea of playing as a Jedi in a way that a lot of games kind of miss. I'm a big believer that the degree to which a game immerses a player in the fantasy it's selling is one of the most important aspects. While a lot of phrasings of this are cliched, a bit pretentious, and often just mocked by the internet, it's a vital force to keep games from becoming generic. The Souls-like influenced emphasis on skillful combat against more difficult enemies suits the idea that Jedi are refined, skillful combatants. How this clicks with you depends on a bit of design philosophy. Do you think that playing as a highly skilled character should mean the game is easier, or should it mean that you're expected to rise to the level of your character? Honestly, it depends, like most questions in art, but this definitely goes for the latter, which I generally prefer. Meanwhile, the Metroidvania-esque emphasis on exploration tap into some of the original appeals of Star Wars as this spacefaring adventure story. The original trilogy aren't just action movies, but equal parts adventure movies about seeing these new planets and fantastic locations, so a bit of exploration suits them perfectly. And the platforming sections also feel quite fun. It's all well animated and feels good to control with just the right amount of weight, although there are a few too many linear climbing sections. You know, the Uncharted kind of thing. And lastly, the way the game implements the Force powers is quite smart. The character you play as was only an apprentice and is now several years out of practice. Throughout the game, he's relearning the basic Force powers. Because fundamentals such as pushing and pulling objects with the Force are things you have to unlock over the game, even these simple things are made to feel powerful and impactful. And this addresses something I think is often a bit of a problem in Star Wars media, especially video games, which is that Jedi often don't feel as special as they should or as they did in the original trilogy. In games, this is often made worse because you either need to worry about balance or because certain powers are inevitably just going to be reduced to basic options. But by making even the common powers something special, they reinforce the idea that being a fully trained Jedi is something significant and powerful. Unfortunately, though, I do have to mention that the story is a whole lot of nothing told quite well. In many ways, it does feel held down by the license, because it's set between episodes 3 and 4. Well, you know it can't do anything that will derail the original trilogy, and it also does feel like it occasionally slips into feeling like it has to go, hey, look at this, do you recognize this place? Not as bad as some stuff, especially in this franchise. You'd never set foot on Tatooine, but it does happen a little bit. At least, as mentioned, it's pretty well told and fun. It really was nice and refreshing to have a great Star Wars game again. I actually haven't gotten around to trying the sequel because I heard there were performance issues on PC. I should probably get to that at some point, shouldn't I? And the last of our big games for 2019 comes on November 20th. Bug Fables, The Everlasting Sapling. A game that is not subtle about what its influences are. It is clearly inspired by the first two Paper Mario games. Yet, it shows what you can do when a game takes its inspiration and then experiments further, unbound by the expectations that the original material had to fulfill. Because of this, I dare say that Bug Fables is better than the games that inspired it. The first two Paper Mario games are tied to the structure of always having Mario, a silent protagonist, plus one active partner out of quite a few. But Bug Fables has three protagonists, all with lines, and all always present from the point where they joined the party. And this is great for both narrative and gameplay reasons. Narratively, it means that it can be written with the fact that you will always have these characters in your party, and lets each of their personalities shine through a lot more. And this means you get to, have actual characters. The main trio are all quite fun, with distinct personalities that contrast nicely. Mostly the game is humorous, but it does at least do enough serious moments to keep the whole thing from becoming a joke that you stop paying attention to. And the character interactions are all fun enough that I find myself viewing as many info conversations, like the equivalent of the field version of the Tattle ability from the Paper Mario games, as I could. Both to learn about the surprisingly detailed setting and just to see more of the main character's banter. In combat, meanwhile, it means you have three characters, all with unique properties that can make planning even basic attacks engaging. V's boomerang can hit and knock down flying enemies. Kabu's horn ignores some defense and can flip over enemies to make them vulnerable. And Leaf's ice magic deals bonus damage to certain enemy types. And this is even before factoring in special moves. And combat is very clearly designed around getting the most out of these special properties and of your limited special moves. The character in the lead does an extra point of damage while being more likely to be attacked. You can get multiple actions, such as one extra action for the party leader when attacking a stunned enemy on the field, or by having one character give up their action to another, but in either case, taking multiple actions reduces the damage done. You need to carefully line up your actions, and to really get the most out of extra actions, you need a character to both be positioned in the front and be using their unique abilities to their full effectiveness. Considering how, especially on hard mode, enemies can hit for quite a bit of damage, taking them out efficiently is vital to making it through. And speaking of, the inclusion of a hard mode is great. Unfortunately, it does have some issues. There's a bit of an early game hell problem, especially while you only have 2 characters. Not to mention no access to shops for consumable items. But it does, for better or for worse, taper off quite notably throughout the game. Although this is likely to depend on how hard you go into using all the systems available to you. I did go slightly insane and made an inventory full of the very best healing items to prepare for the final boss. And I did this before they added the option to speed up the cooking cutscene. Yeah, I think just for my patience I earned the easier final boss fight there. But in any case, it's nice to have a hard mode as an option for those who really want to be pushed to use the systems to their fullest. Compared to Paper Mario 2, where I just always felt things were a little too easy to the point where it didn't really reward me for engaging with the systems more because the game was going to be easy anyway. But that's Bug Fables. A game that wears its inspiration on its sleeve, and if you ask me, surpasses the original in the process. I cannot recommend this enough to any classic Paper Mario fans. It's also a lesson in being able to see where classic titles can be improved. Being more faithful to its inspiration would have just made Bug Fables a worse, less creative, and more derivative game. And that was the last full section on a single game. But do you want to know the really fun part about 2019? This has all been just the abridged version where I talked about the games this year that were most meaningful to me. There's a whole ton of games that I played this year but didn't quite mention a section of their own. Some of these I don't even have anything to say about other than they existed. But I want to include them because it's really important to have smaller games to fill the gaps between the big releases. In my opinion, this is what turns a year with a few great games into a year of great games. It's not all about how big the biggest games were, but also about how much you had to do while between those big games. Anyway, I'm gonna try and make this quick. January 21st, The Hong Kong Massacre was the first new game I played this year. Honestly kind of unremarkable, a bit like Hotline Miami, but not as interesting, but with a John Woo style flavor to it. But I remember it for having been the first new game I played this year. It was a nice appetizer while I was waiting for Resident Evil 2. On January 23rd, Slay the Spire left early access. But I'd already been playing it for a while, and I was busy, so I don't really associate it with this time. I just thought I should mention it. February 1st, we got Wargroove. March 20th, we got Super Robot Wars T. March 27th, we got Risk of Rain 2, a fantastic sequel to one of the pioneering roguelites, and frankly, probably the roguelite I go back to most these days. It did a wonderful job of bringing the original game into the third dimension while addressing what flaws there were. On April 18th, we got both God's Trigger and Katana Zero, two great indie games. I especially recommend Katana Zero. June 11th, we got Collection of Mana, which is most notable for being the first official English release of Seiken Densetsu 3, which is now known as Trials of Mana. Having other games there was just gravy. Really should play those other games sometime, shouldn't I? June 17th, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night was a great spiritual successor to Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Not as impressive as some other comebacks, since the 2D Metroidvania has long been a staple of the indie scene, but still cool to see. On June 20th, we got My Friend Pedro, a very fun, if very silly, 2D platformer slash shooter. On August 6th, we got Metal Wolf Chaos XD, which finally brought the most American game ever made to America! Thanks, From Software. August 13th, we got Dicey Dungeons, pretty much Slay the Spire with dice instead of cards. On September 6th, we got Monster Hunter World Iceborne, which definitely did a lot to improve on the base game, but given how my feelings on Modern Monster Hunter have developed since then, I don't have much to say until I replay the whole game and expansion, which I might be doing for my next videos, so look forward to that. September 10th, we got Blasphemous, a great Metroidvania with a cool and unique aesthetic and satisfyingly challenging gameplay that borrows a bit from Souls games. No, this is not a Souls-like, for the same reason Sekiro and Jedi Fallen Order are not. September 10th, we got Daemon X Machina, a game that sure did want to be Armored Core 4. I was really excited because I always want more mech games, but yeah, just never clicked for me. On September 20th, we got Link's Awakening Switch, which gave us a really great dose of classic Zelda, not to mention remaking one of the best 2D Zeldas. Honestly, I'd kill for them to make a new 2D Zelda again sometime. It's been over a decade since we last had a brand new one. I also appreciate it for being a remake of a classic game that plays it conservative with modernizing. It's nice to see a game confident the original version still holds up, rather than trying to turn this into 2D Breath of the Wild, wearing a few accessories to make it look like Link's Awakening. On September 26th, we got Code Vein, which was an interesting anime-influenced Souls-like that I never quite clicked with at the time. Look, I was spoiled for good action games this year, but maybe now that I'm more into alternative Souls-like experiences such as Lies of P, I should give it another shot. On October 10th, we got Valfaris. On November 27th, we got SD Gundam G Generation Crossrays. On December 3rd, Halo Master Chief Collection gave me my first experience with the Halo series. Besides playing like half of Halo 2 at a youth center once upon a time and playing a few rounds of Reach with my cousin once. Oh, and I did play 3 once too. Look, it was my first time owning or playing these games to completion. They were fun. I don't have more to say. And lastly, on December 10th, Hades left early access. Another great roguelite, and one of the most popular, but honestly I've never been the most into it. I don't know. It's good though. But wait, there's more. Yes, there's a few games here that I only played in later years. These don't get dates because, well, the dates don't really matter here from my perspective, but they help flesh out the year even more. Fire Emblem Three Houses would get me back into Fire Emblem when I played it. I still need to play some of the other routes, though. Control was a fun and creative third-person shooter with a lot of untapped potential, but great brutalist environments. Remnant from the Ashes is one of the best looter shooter games I've ever played. I did a video on it ages ago, but it has loot and progression systems actually designed for online multiplayer. When I finally played through the Gunvolt series, Luminous Avenger X might well be one of my favorite of the titles, just for how powerful the protagonist feels and how fast the gameplay is. MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries would give me a few fun campaigns once I had some of the DLC. While I'm more into the Japanese style of mechs, I'm not going to turn down a bit of giant robot fun if it's well made. And The Surge 2 deserves a Most Improved award. I did not like the first title, as I found it to take inspiration from Dark Souls and then add nothing to it but frustration. The Surge 2, meanwhile, is a pretty decent cyberpunk Souls-like, even if it doesn't live up to its full potential. And finally, there's a couple of great games that I just didn't play for whatever reason. Let's see, Kingdom Hearts 3 was a big deal just for finally coming out. Don't actually know how well it was received, but it was a big deal. Shame I've only played like 2 of the prior 100 games. Disco Elysium is a game I still hear great things about to this day. I really should play it. Yep, I really should play it. Baba Is You has always looked neat to me, and yeah, I don't have anything more to say, it just always looked neat to me. And lastly, Persona Q2. I wasn't a Persona fan yet when this came out, and I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But along with Etrian Odyssey Nexus, Atlas gave the 3DS a nice little send-off here. There are some other games that were disappointing admittedly, or games that were simply fine and didn't make any of these lists. But that's okay, I'm sure someone loved those games, and in my book that just makes the year even better, even if it didn't affect me directly. And heck, I'm sure there are some that I did really like, but just didn't leave enough of an impression to even make this list. Anyway, let's put a bow on this massive project. 2019 was an amazing year for video games, more so than any year in recent memory, at least to me. It delivered both quantity and quality of games for my peculiar tastes. And since I was kind of starting to fall out of touch with gaming before this, I can honestly say I probably wouldn't be making these YouTube videos if I hadn't had such a blast in 2019. And after all of that, 2020 was looking stacked as well. Not as amazing, but still very good, better than most of the 2010s. Heck, several of my favorites in 2020 were Japanese games who released in their home country in 2019. They just took until 2020 to make it over to America. 13 Sentinels, Aegis Rim, and Persona 5 Royale come to mind here. But this all had me convinced that video games were back to being something I loved. It sure would suck if everything went to shit, you know, like a global pandemic that weakens the back half of 2020 and renders 2021 into a boring year that I mostly spent playing old games and remakes. Or, you know, the release of a new console generation that does as new console generations often do and pull the handbrake on the entire video game industry. Or the Nintendo Switch, which was at its peak in 2019, losing its luster due to people's obsession with tech specs, making a console that always was going to be underpowered fall behind quite quickly. Wait, shit, all of that happened. Well, damn. But hey, realistically, look, I know my tastes ain't typical. It's weird to see a year that caters to me this much. And it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of people found 2019 to be a pretty dull year because they have more normal tastes or something. But it was special to me. And maybe a rare miracle where everything lines up is enough to remind me why I love video games every so often. But do you think I'm dead wrong and there's a better year for video games? Then make your own video like this. Okay, I realize that sounds dismissive, but I'm serious here. Make a video celebrating what made your favorite year special. Talk about all the games that made it special. And hopefully some of those would be games that might not get the remembrance they deserve. That's another reason I wanted to make this video. I'm sure some of the stuff I talked about will still be discussed in 10 or 20 years, but I've been reaching the age where stuff from my childhood and early teenage years is becoming retro, and as a result I'm seeing how only a relatively thin slice of the things that mattered at the time are getting love in retrospect. Sometimes even things from major franchises or companies are just glossed over. Which is why I wanted to include all the little games I didn't even have much to say about in this video. Because I wanted to include as many games as possible. I didn't just want to celebrate the big memorable titles, I want to remember the small stuff, even if just in passing. Because these are the kinds of games that don't get remembered, yet they're an integral part of the experience of being into video games at a given point in time. And I'm sure even some of the bigger titles I highlighted will still fall through the cracks of history. After Elden Ring's breakout success, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if in 10 or 20 years, Sekiro's lumped in with all the non-Kingsfield and Armored Core things that FromSoft did before Dark Souls as just one of their weird titles they did at some point. But that's that. Here's hoping I brought back some fond memories, or maybe got you to replay something. Or maybe there's something on my list that you haven't played and now you want to play it for the first time. Or you looked into one of the games from the lightning rounds and now you're curious. That's what I'm here for, after all. To get people to play or at least think about games they might not otherwise. And maybe say some intriguing stuff that gets you thinking about video games in new ways. But if you're still watching this far in, first off, thanks. But what did you think of 2019's games? Did I completely miss any of your favorites from this wonderful year? Is there another year you think is just as good? Still should probably make a full video if that's the case. But let me know in the comments below. For now, this is Mikhail, signing off.